There was an interesting question from Rosa Abraham. If the income cutoff was revised to take care of non-food needs, then wouldn't income poverty line be useful? Yes, of course it would be useful, but an income of some household doesn't reflect necessarily the quality of their life, the quality of their housing, the quality of the services. And there was a very good response from Anamika Singh to it, which actually says it better than I can. There was various questions on how to analyze the effectiveness of any welfare scheme by governments to elevate the living standards. Well, it's relatively easy to assess that simply by going and listening to, working with, and hearing what low-income groups say themselves, their self-assessment, their self-reflection. In terms of how can a rights-based approach, Nisha Ninan asked, how can a rights-based approach be thought of in the context of poverty reduction in order to achieve conditions of justice? Well, the Slum and Shack Dwellers Federations that now exist in over 35 nations, they don't so much use the rights approach as what they would call the rights plus approach. There's no point in demanding from the state what it can't provide. So, you know, if you were to march 2 million strong to Mumbai Municipal Corporation and say that we have the right to housing, the civil servants may actually agree with you, but they have no capacity to build or to allocate housing for 2 million people. So the right plus approach is actually where the organized urban poor offer local government a partnership, and by working together, they can realize their rights. So government isn't someone you press and harry, it's someone you draw in as a trusted partner, and so much more is achieved. Okay, so some nice questions coming in. There's a question from Anna Fay. Didn't see much progress on urban poverty lately. Do you think they're going to be included in SDG 11? And how do you think they will materialize? I suppose two comments. One is that an awful lot of the other SDGs have huge relevance for urban areas. It's just that they are given as national goals. So, you know, literacy, education, healthcare. SDGs on these are as important in urban areas as in rural areas. SDG 11. One of my big disappointments with the SDGs is no room was left for local governments to make their commitments. You know, national governments went and made all these commitments, but for many of them in urban areas, it depends on local government to actually implement them. I think what would get the SDGs implemented in urban areas is local governments seeing them as relevant to their program, their policies, their strategies. And in a sense, in making their commitment, a commitment by a local government to meeting the SDGs that are its responsibilities would have much more power than national governments making those commitments. The question on how do we achieve a balance between urban and non-urban areas on the planet? Well, you just got to make sure that high consumption lifestyles don't get embedded in rural or in urban areas. It's funny, I mean, we talk about urban areas and rural areas because there's very important differences in context. You know, to have 500,000 people in 2 square kilometers is not the same as a farming community or a fishing community. So we separate them because they have different contexts which present different challenges. But then we've got to recognize that rural and urban are so intimately connected through flows of people, money, ideas, resources. So I don't think all urban specialists have to at least have some knowledge of rural-urban interactions. Otherwise, it makes no sense. I got a question from Dewadan Wadan, and I'm afraid I don't know enough about network sciences to answer your question. Sirajul Islam asked, can you inform us of any examples of city-based poverty reduction initiatives in the past and present governments? Well, in Latin America, you've seen a whole range of cities become very successful in reducing poverty. Part of it was to do with the political changes, as almost all governments turned from dictatorships to democracies. And as they returned to democracies, very often with strong social movement pressure, the constitutions were changed. Local governments were made elected, mayors were made elected. And so there's dozens of examples in Latin America of city governments doing what they should in terms of guaranteeing access to decent water, to good sanitation, healthcare, schools, the rule of law. Very often new participatory methods of interaction between civil society and government. And because this was done in Brazil and in the rest of Latin America, much of the documentation is only in Portuguese and in Spanish. There's been so much innovation in Latin America that we English speakers know so little about. Then you've got the example of a national government agency that knows how to work with and support grassroots initiatives. The Community Organizations Development Institute in Thailand. It's a wonderful example of how a national agency can facilitate very strongly community-driven processes, reaching 90 to 100,000 households since it started in 2003. Question from Diana. Do you think that the universal revenue currently tested in Finland and the Netherlands can be a universal solution for poverty elimination? Well, it can certainly remove some of the worst difficulties facing those with no incomes. And we've seen that small income supplements in Brazil have been very important in improving children's attendance at school, nutrition, health. But when you have the chance to go and talk to grassroots organizations, they actually want to be within and part of our society. They don't want to be sidelined with a kind of minimum income. And so you know, in countries and cities where so much of the population lacks piped water to their homes, sewers, storm drains, healthcare, policing, decent public transport, these are all issues that have to be addressed. The most important lesson I learned from the grassroots leaders is that unless the urban poor are organized, even a supportive government will fail to provide them with the support they actually need. Deep T. Raj asks, notes that segregation has been a persistent problem across cities. What impact can it have on urban sustainable development or on urban poverty? Well, I suppose that the more the middle and upper income groups distance themselves from low income groups, the less they will understand their needs and priorities. And we can see in some cities in Latin America, the upper middle and the high income groups live in gated communities. They drive to gated country clubs in the evening and go to gated communities to see their friends. Their employment is also very often in gated communities. It's just a crazy way to run a city. Devadan Wadan asks, is vulnerability to economic, political, cultural, ethnic and natural risks a better perspective on urban policy making than poverty only? Well, almost all measures to reduce poverty reduce risk. One of the difficulties with talking about risks is there's so many different interpretations. When I talk about risk, it's risk to human health, premature death, illness, injury, or loss of livelihood, or loss of asset. But many people, risk is financial risk, or risk is disaster risk. What we certainly need is more attention to risk, but getting coherence across the whole spectrum of risk. So you include the everyday risks, acute respiratory infections, diarrheal diseases, tuberculosis, all the really nasty diseases that should be prevented. Fires, scalds, burns, traffic accidents, all these kind of constitute a mix of risks for urban dwellers every day. Then you integrate into that disaster risk and risk from small disasters that don't get included in disaster databases. If you can generate good data about all of those, you've got a much stronger basis for addressing poverty, addressing inequality, and radically improving health. Diana is asking, as banks are lobbying to include financial information and the concept of digital identity of the person, a smart city is going to be more or less inclusive? I haven't got a clue. I'm a bit disappointed. The literature on smart cities doesn't address an awful lot of most serious urban problems. Nisha Ninan, how can a rights-based approach be thought about in the context of poverty reduction? You know, I mentioned, I commented on this a little bit earlier. The low-income groups and their community organizations, they should be the ones that press for change, press for justice, press for less inequality. That's why they sometimes term what they do as the rights plus agenda. It's making demands, but also offering themselves as partners in actually addressing their needs. Enoa Marcos asks, how can cities be made beacons for global poverty reduction? I suppose that the response I gave a little bit earlier about the cities in Latin America is one good set of reasons. The other great set of examples come from the federations of slum dwellers or federations of shack dwellers that are now so active in over 30 nations. And what you see them do is they have savings groups at their base, mostly women-led, most women as savers. The women savings groups federate. They federate at district level, they federate at city level, they federate at national level. And this then gives them more opportunity to lobby at higher levels of government. And what all these federations also do is that a savings group will take on an initiative. It will see whether it can do it. It'll try building or try designing and building a community toilet, or if they can get land and building their own homes. But this also means that they can use these as precedent-setting projects. If you take a minister or a senior civil servant to see 30 beautifully built houses with strong costings telling how little they actually cost to build, then the minister or the civil servant will look at the people that implemented them in a new light. What we've seen is more and more city governments choosing to ally with urban poor federations, slum federations, shack dweller federations, because they know that combined they can achieve so much more. And this to me is the most exciting. Here you have a urban social movement drawing from over 30 nations, all with a coherent message of demands and also of offers of resources and support. It's rather weird doing this because I can't hear any of you, I just get your questions typed. Shanmuga Priya, where do we start resilience planning? What are the key attributes of resilience planning? How inclusive should they be? Well, if we're talking resilience to extreme weather, good housing and living conditions, good infrastructure, good services are the key to resilience. Of course, some of the standards will need adjusting as more extreme weather events take place or events that are more extreme. But there's such a strong complement between good quality housing and basic services, disaster risk reduction, and climate change resilience, All three of those are concerned with identifying local risk and acting on them. And there's lots of complementarities. In many ways, a city with a strong development orientation can fold in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation relatively easily. Sorry, I'm just reading the questions. Namrata Nayak, what can a civil society contribute towards urban poverty reduction? Well, we go back to the federations, the slum and Shaktiwala federations that are active in over 30 nations. These are people that are really driving urban poverty reduction. They're helping stop evictions. They're helping transform the provision for water and sanitation. They're demonstrating new ways of building cheaply. In many places, they're negotiating upgrading, and upgrading that benefits everyone in the settlement, generating a consensus that's very difficult to achieve by external professionals or specialists. Rosa Abraham, isn't there a rationale to maintain a distinction between urban and rural poverty? Yes, absolutely. As long as we recognize that it's between urban and rural areas. Urban contexts are different from rural contexts. Large city contexts are different from small town contexts. In any city, there's people moving out as well as people moving in. There's flows of money between rural and urban areas. There's flows of people, flows of goods, information. So we go back to the need to understand urban poverty and the context that makes it particularly relevant to urban areas, and look at rural poverty with its particular characteristics, and at the same time see the multiple interconnections between urban and rural economies. An improvement in urban poverty feedback on rural poverty, well, of course it depends, but very often a prosperous an increasingly prosperous urban population is feeding remittances back to rural areas. Rural and urban poverty could be in conflict with each other if there were limited resources and there was a decision to channel them all to urban areas or all to rural areas. But hopefully we've got past that kind of very rigid approach since the 1970s. There's a question: how do poor people who are particularly vulnerable to climate risk? I suppose it goes back to the same litany of risk-reducing infrastructure and services, good development, legal houses, better built houses, good piped water, good sewers and covered storm drains, good health care, good emergency services, good garbage collection and disposal, easy access to schools, policing, the ability of those living in informal settlements to get onto the voters' register. In some places, if you don't have a legal address, you can't get on the voters' register. All of these improve resilience to extreme weather, improve resilience to the threat of loss of assets or loss of life. And we've really got to, I mean, one of the difficulties here is that everyone tries to separate funding for adaptation from funding from development. But in most cities in the global south, you can't separate the two. Most of the priorities for building resilience to climate change are filling in the deficits in housing and water and sanitation and drainage and healthcare and schools and the rule of law. But there's a question, Boglaka Ivangova. Please excuse me if I mispronounce your name. What's your take on the new urban agenda? Well, it ain't new. It's not really urban, and it's not really an agenda. I was hugely disappointed with the new urban agenda. The Sustainable Development Goals have provided us with a framework for addressing need and achieving more ecological sustainability. What the new urban agenda was meant to do was to specify how urban governments could actually contribute to that. It had a very simple task. It already had the goals and the targets agreed. What it had to do is to demonstrate how urban government can contribute to all those SDGs within its boundaries, within its jurisdiction. Instead, what we got was another list of commitments of we commit, we commit, we commit. National governments committing to what local governments should be doing. There's some astonishing lapses in the document. For instance, it's meant to be about local government. Where's a discussion of mayors? In the 23 pages of the new urban agenda, the word mayor does not appear once. Can you elaborate 10 essentials that should have been prioritized? We actually, with my friend and colleague Cassidy Johnson, we did a blog on the 10 essentials for meeting the new urban agenda. It's probably best if you go and look at that. One of the things that impressed me about the disaster risk community is that they understand the key role of local government. And so in the strategy for disaster risk reduction, originally they had 10 essentials. And the 10 essentials were all issues that local government could see were their issues. So, without having much funding, the UN has managed to promote disaster risk reduction around a very simple set of goals. I wish the new urban agenda had done that. In terms of the 10 essentials that should be prioritized, I think pretty much everyone knows it. I have the standard literally. But certainly what should be prioritized is stronger, more competent local governments, more accountability and transparency, commitments to meet the SDGs for urban populations in water and sanitation and drainage and healthcare and schools, the rule of law and policing, recognition of the right of the urban poor to organize and make demands, and to recognize their legitimacy in changing policies and practices. In the end, it's going to be local government and local civil society that's going to drive the changes that will avoid dangerous climate change, will avoid increasing poverty. The difficulty now is that they get so little attention by international agencies and national governments. A question from Dewadan Wadan. Regarding risk, can we devise a matrix of risk across 6 data sectors: health, food, work, assets, shelter, and education, that would capture vulnerability better than poverty per se? I would prefer to see a matrix of risks across everyday hazards, small disasters and large disasters, and relevant to climate change adaptation, and to build those. It's so much risk is around. Health isn't a separate sector when you're looking at risk. Risk in whatever sector you are is involving assessments of health risks. I can hear Karen was typing away madly to get me the next question. I suppose there's no way that those that are listening to this can actually talk back. It's a bit strange talking into a computer screen with no responses. What are your thoughts on social protection for health for the poor? Well, social protection is one among a number of measures that help reduce elements of poverty. I much prefer it if poverty reduction is defined at city level by the interaction between grassroots organizations and their federations and local government. So we don't go in with a list of priorities. We go in with a commitment to build local institutions with the capability of delivering all of the aspects that reduce poverty. One of the things that worries me is that the pressure groups have become so splintered. Within the United Nations, we have pressure groups that will push, obviously, for gender equality, for migrants, for infants, for children, for those with disabilities, those facing discrimination on the basis of religion or ethnic status. You press for water, you press for sanitation, you press for healthcare, you press for schools, you press for the least developed nations. So the kind of blocks of people have built around these. And so in all the UN discussions, your commitment is to get your particular interest group in the text. What this takes attention away from is the local institutions that are needed to actually address what is your priority. And I think we must spend far more time not focusing on particular needs, but focusing on the local processes that allow needs to be met. Namrata Nayak asks, while urban infrastructure development, with our urban infrastructure development, we often affect nature and natural resources. When is it justified, acceptable, and what is more important? Well, it's quite possible to do building an infrastructure with respect for ecosystem services and for resources that, well, land resources, forests, areas of biodiversity that shouldn't be developed on. You know, people worry that cities are expanding to take over so much of the world's land, but they actually sit on a very, very small proportion of the Earth's surface. By one estimate, less than 1%. Other estimates suggest 2 or 3%. So I think we've learned in the last 20 to 30 years how to work within ecological processes and ecological services within and around cities. The difficulty is that it's just not applied very much. We have the knowledge, but we haven't changed the institutional mindset of most local governments to try and follow that. Question, when thinking about housing, why doesn't the rights-based approach work? Well, in part because who do you ask for a house? Who has the capacity to provide you with a house? Who could provide the housing for, what, 10 million people living in Mumbai in informal settlements? Who could provide the houses for Dar es Salaam's low-income groups? 80% of Dar es Salaam live in informal settlements. Rather than the right to housing, they ought to have the right to influence decisions made by their local governments. They should have the right to be able to use local resources for their benefit. I think it's going back to the point made earlier. We must focus less on particular needs, housing, water, sanitation, drainage, focus much more on the local processes by which low-income groups and their community organizations can get them addressing their priorities rather than ours. I would absolutely welcome any of you to ask, to query or to question what I've said. Spiritual Islam gave some interesting suggestions for indicators to track urban poverty. Much of bit around the quality of urban employment. The difficulty is that it's a lot of what are suggested for indicators. It's difficult to get the information. The official statistical systems of most countries don't generate that information. How can local governments and communities come to the same platforms for discussion and debates? Well, one of the impressive things about the Slum and Shackletters Federations that I mentioned earlier is that they welcome local governments coming to work with them and forming joint platforms. And there's at least 100 cities where there are funds that are jointly managed by grassroots organizations and federations and local government. We've also seen it in Latin America and in some other places through participatory budgeting, which isn't quite as active as the federations. The federations are actually helping build solutions. But participatory budgeting did provide every district in a city with the right to define its priorities for public investment. And over a 5 to 10 year period, it certainly changed the resource allocations, made them much more towards the priorities of low-income groups. The other beauty of participatory budgeting is that the budgeting process becomes so much more transparent. So citizens know what money is and how it's actually allocated. Question, what is the difference between law and justice? When does law not work for the poor? Well, I suppose when the poor are not organized and when the poor don't have any influence on government, the law very often works against them. There's Gautam Ban from IIHS's amazing book about evictions and civil rights and how public interest litigation in India moved from being pro-poor to being very pro-middle class. It's a wonderful read and answers that question much better than I can. I think we're running out of questions. I wonder if there's questions that were asked earlier. Some people raise this issue of unskilled migrants moving to cities as if this contributed to poverty. But of course it doesn't contribute to poverty. Flows of people follow very precisely flows and changes in economic opportunity. Of course, conflict and civil war provide some exceptions. But what drives city economies is very often low-income groups, including a proportion of migrants. Why is there a huge number of informal settlements in cities? It's not because of rapid migration, it's because government didn't do its job. And somehow blaming migrants is a clever way of government getting out of its own responsibilities. I remember talking to a senior civil servant some years ago, and he was complaining to me about how many migrants are flooding his city and making it difficult, and they're all unemployed, and why don't they go back to their rural areas? So I asked him, do you have a driver? Yes. Do you have a gardener? Yes. Do you have a security guard? Yes. Do you have a maid? Yes. Do you have a cook? Yes. Do you have someone that does your laundry? Yes. Someone who comes and collects our laundry every day. When you see them next, ask them where they live. I met him 2 weeks later, and of course, all of the people who gave him such a high quality of life with good quality services lived in the informal settlements. And they weren't recent migrants who were unemployed. They had actually been in the city for a long time. We need to do more to change these inaccurate and negative attitudes about migrants. Oh, this is a very nice question. Alain Fay, talking about finance and local authorities, do you think the international community will agree to setting pool funds for sustainable urban development under Mayor's leadership? If I was to dream the two funds that I would like to see in each country, one is a well-run infrastructure and service fund for municipal authorities, elected municipal authorities. The other is a fund that grassroots organizations can draw on direct. In many ways, the biggest crisis to me now is the lack of intermediaries. Aid agencies and development banks, they say they implement projects, but they don't implement projects. They pay others to implement projects. So an aid agency or a development bank is only as effective as the intermediaries they use. And of course, the money usually passes to national government, where some may go to local government, some may even trickle down to low-income groups. But low-income groups don't get to choose how the funding is spent. What I would love to see is funds they can draw on direct themselves. And you've got some funds, some of the federations, the Slum and Shack Dweller federations, such as those in Kenya, already have their own local funds set up. And it's through that they fund their savings groups to try out new things. The umbrella organization for all these federations, Slum Shack Dwellers Federation, Slum Shack Dwellers International, they have an Urban Poor Fund International, which helps support the innovations and the precedent setting done by member federations in other countries. So I think, I know there's all sorts of political difficulties. National governments will not welcome a fund for local authorities that they don't control. But if we accept that local governments and local civil society are the key to most of the SDGs, we have to find ways of resourcing them. And at the moment, we certainly don't. I mean, the amount of money that goes to local governments and local civil society is very, very small and probably still diminishing. Gariba has warned me that I only have 10 minutes left. So I should also start closing with the key points that you should bear in mind. I welcome suggestions as to what the key points are. I think the point about local funds is the one that I would stress. I would also stress we have to listen to, work with and support the organizations formed by low-income groups. At the moment, very, 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 very little funding goes to support the federations. It's funny because people talk about the federations as stakeholders. They're not stakeholders. They're actually the people representing those whose unmet needs are the basis for the whole of the SDGs and the whole of the new urban agenda. They aren't stakeholders. They're actually at the center of need. They're also at the center of generating innovations to address those needs. I suppose I would also love to see income-based poverty lines set so that they represented the real cost of meeting non-food needs. There was an amazing initiative by the Asian Coalition for Housing Rights. They invited community leaders from 6 Asian nations to discuss how they would define and measure poverty. And after discussions in Thailand, the community organizers went back to their countries and behaved like good researchers, did large household surveys, asked all sorts of difficult questions about health and about income. But of course, because it was the community leaders doing the interviews, the data they got was so much more specific and accurate. And they then came back and compiled an amazing report. Please email me if you want a copy of that report on how they would define, measure and monitor poverty. Sorry, define, measure and monitor urban poverty. It was far more sophisticated than most government national statistical offices. We're encouraging these community organizers to go and bang on the door of the National Institute of Statistics or the Census Bureaus and say, we've come with our expertise to help you overhaul your questionnaires. Alain Fay comment, unfortunately, we're still living in a very centralized system. Yes. Mayors will also have to fight ministries of finance. Yes. Ministries of local government. Yes. And ministries of housing. Yes. Provincial councils too. Yes. But you did get some very strong decentralization in Latin America, and the very strong social movements and strong social pressures to get rid of the dictatorships produced the basis for that. I suppose since 1974, when I started work in this field, decentralizing funds to local governments, making local governments more accountable and transparent has been a constant theme. That we haven't been so successful at it does not mean that it's still not an important theme, and it just needs to be pushed and pushed and pushed. We also need to celebrate more the countries and the cities which show decentralization working really well. I'm encouraged that at least internationally, now we have strong representative organizations for local governments, United Cities and Local Governments, ICLEI, C40, and I'm sure there's others. And these are helping set and drive new agendas for sustainable development for local governments. Hopefully this will then help in the context of getting local government more support from provincial and national governments. Sarah Feldman asks, for someone interested in following a career in cities and climate change adaptation within what master's program would you recommend? But it's going to sound like a family pleading, because I'm a visiting professor at University College London. The Development Planning Unit at University College London runs many masters on environment and sustainable development in cities and has a special module on climate change adaptation. I would strongly recommend that to anyone wanting a really strong grounding in urban development. And once that grounding is there, introducing how climate change adaptation can fit within that. I'm interested to hear actually any of you who've come across good courses on climate change adaptation. It's so important that they're in institutions that work on development issues. Anna Fay again. South America in general is quite an exception, as the fight started in the 70s. Society with it, leaders in society. Africa and Asia, sorry, I've got to top up the block. In Africa and Asia are still behind in that sense. Yes, absolutely. But also remember that in the 70s, how awful conditions were in Latin American cities. Enormous informal settlements, bulldozing, the health and nutrition status that were terrible. I know this sounds a little bit optimistic, but sometimes it takes a while for institutional structures to change the new realities, and specifically its rapid urbanization. I'm kind of hoping that the kind of sensible things that Latin American democracy did for cities will manifest itself more in Africa and Asia. Less fantasy about creating world-class cities, more attention to actually working with their population to meet local needs and priorities. I suppose as editor of the journal Environment and Urbanization, I can't help but a quick plug to the journal I edit. But this has got, I mean, you're welcome to email me, this has got material that responds better than I to all the questions that you've answered. Sorry, all the questions that you've asked. I suppose it just remains for me to thank you for your questions. I wish we could have talked direct, but maybe next year that might be possible. by Gerima,